Greetings, I'm Rear Admiral Owen Swart of the Federation Starship Dauntless, and I'm here today with another episode of Star Trek Apologetics, which is the show where we try to make sense of the apparent contradictions within the canon of Star Trek, and where Star Trek contradicts with apparent reality. And today I'm going to be talking about, although I usually try to address specific questions in the show, today I wanted to talk about a general topic which relates to a lot of questions, and hopefully I can preempt a lot of the questions you otherwise would have asked. And that is talking about apparent inconsistencies in warp speed. So what is warp speed? Warp speed is, in Star Trek, the mechanism that most interstellar starships use for traveling faster than the speed of light. So in other words, if you want to travel really long distances from one star system to another, traveling slower than the speed of light just isn't practical. It'll take you forever to get there. For example, if you wanted to travel from Earth to our nearest neighboring solar system, Alpha Centauri, it would take you about 4 years at the speed of light. If you're traveling at lower than the speed of light, let's say full impulse, which is 1/4 the speed of light, it would take you, what's that, 16 years to get there. That's just not practical. You can't travel long distances moving slower than the speed of light. So warp drive is the system that they use in Star Trek to travel faster than light. And warp speed is measured in warp factors. You'll often hear the characters say warp factor 1, warp factor 2. What does that mean? When you're measuring speed at any time, so when you're measuring speed in your car, you're measuring your speed at usually kilometers per hour, or if you're in America, miles per hour. If you're flying a jet plane, say a supersonic jet, you might be measuring your speed in terms of Mach value. So Mach 1 is the speed of sound, Mach 2 would be twice the speed of sound, and so on. With warp factor, it's a little bit more complicated than that, and we'll get into what those complications are. But when we're talking about warp factor in the next generation era, so that's mid to late 24th century and onwards, warp factor is the amount of warping that's being done to space-time by your warp engine. And it's expressed in terms of the resultant velocity. Warp factor 1 means that you're traveling at the speed of light. And that goes all the way up to a maximum possible speed of warp factor 10, which is actually infinite speed. What that means is you're traveling so fast that you're existing at all points in the universe simultaneously. And then there's a gradated scale between those two. Warp factor 9.9998 is what we call subspace speed, or transwarp speed. Anything faster than that, you're traveling at transwarp, which means that you need a method of propulsion beyond simple warp drive. You need something a little bit extra. And that's also the speed at which subspace radio travels. Subspace radio is the faster than light communication system that they use in Star Trek to communicate over relatively long distances. The Phoenix, which was the warp drive prototype that we saw in Star Trek First Contact, she traveled at warp factor 1. The Enterprise NX-01 had a warp 5 engine, which meant that her theoretical maximum speed was warp factor 5. I think we saw her go a little bit over warp factor 5 once or twice, but that was the theoretical limit. She was designed to run at that speed. By the next generation, you'll look at the normal cruising speed of most of those ships are between warp factor 6 and warp factor 8, with the maximum possible speed in excess of warp 9. I think the Sovereign class Enterprise, the Enterprise E, she had a maximum emergency speed of warp factor 9.99, which she could maintain for about half an hour. But what are the inconsistencies? Although we have an established scale of what warp speeds are, we also have in Star Trek, in numerous occasions, explicit distances that have been traveled at certain warp speeds that don't appear to add up. So, for example, we talk about the planet Kronos, which is the Klingon homeworld. Now, the planet Kronos, we actually know where that is. It's in the Omega Leonis sector, which means that it's not... Omega Leonis is a star that's known to us, although Kronos doesn't orbit that star, it is relatively close, within a couple of light years of Omega Leonis. And it's also been expressly stated in the dialogue more than once that Kronos is it's between sort of 75 and 90 light years away. They've never given us an exact reading, but they've sort of given us round numbers. So that means that it would take, if you're traveling at warp 1, it would take you between 75 and 90 years to get there. If you're traveling at warp 10, it would take you 0 time to get there. If you're traveling at warp factor 9.99, which is the maximum cruise velocity of the Sovereign class starship, the maximum emergency velocity of the Sovereign class starship, it would take you about 4 days to get there. But that's interesting. So it would take you 4 days to get there at warp factor 9.99. But if you were paying attention in the first episode of Star Trek Enterprise, the two-part named Broken Bow, they talked about the Enterprise NX-01, which had a maximum theoretical speed of warp factor 5. It would take her 4 days to get there, to travel that distance. That's 75 to 90 light years. That doesn't add up. How is it possible that that there's such a vast disparity in these expressed warp factor values? Well, so this has been a head scratcher for Star Trek apologists the whole time, but we've come up with a couple of possible solutions. Firstly, it's our belief that the warp factor speed scale was changed at some point between Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, and the beginning of the Next Generation series. So in the first half of the 24th century, at some point the warp factor the warp factor scale was altered somehow. Exactly how it was altered is an interesting question, and that's something that remains contested to this day. Now, we have a pretty good understanding of how the warp speed scale works in the Next Generation timeline, in the Next Generation period, but in the original series period and earlier, it seems to work differently. But without getting into the maths of it, I want to try and come up with an analogy to help you at least understand the concept of it. So, if you grew up like I did in the 80s or earlier, and you ever were in the need of buying a light bulb, you would go out to the supermarket and you would buy a light bulb that looked something like this. This is an ordinary incandescent light bulb, what we used to call a 60-watt light bulb. Now, when we were buying light bulbs, we knew how bright we wanted a light bulb to be. Pretty much the only options we had were sort of 60 watt, 100 watt, maybe 120 watt. So wattage in this context is an expression of the energy output of the globe. Now, most incandescent light bulbs had roughly the same efficiency, which means that if it was using 100 watts of energy, then it was putting out light. But now, watt value doesn't tell you how much light the bulb is emitting. It's telling you how much energy it's using. But because they all were roughly the same efficiency, we knew that if the globe was using about 100 watts of energy, that it was putting out roughly 1,500 lumens of light. Lumen is the SI unit that we use to measure the amount of visible light available. So because all of these globes were roughly the same level of efficiency, we could buy our globes based on the wattage. But that kind of got a bit complicated a few years ago when we started seeing these turning up in supermarkets. So this is a fluorescent light bulb. Now, this fluorescent light bulb puts out roughly the same amount of light measured in lumens as this incandescent light bulb, which is roughly 1,000 to 1,500. I haven't measured it, but that's what it said on the box. We're looking at that sort of range of lumens. But this fluorescent light bulb only uses 14 watts worth of energy. This is a far more efficient light bulb. Now with these two, this is an interesting analogy for how the warp speed scale used to work in the 23rd century and earlier. Because of all warp drives were, or at least all Federation and Earth warp drives had a comparable level of efficiency, you could measure the speed by the amount of energy that the warp drive was using. But some point in the late 23rd and early 24th century, there was a leap forward in technology, and the new warp drives were suddenly a lot more efficient than their predecessors, which meant that the old warp speed scale, if we were measuring the energy output of an engine, it wasn't really comparing to its earlier counterparts in terms of how fast it was actually moving. So then it seems that they changed the warp speed scale. Instead of reflecting the energy output of the engines, it was measuring the resultant velocity of the starship. And we can see this because in Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and the various films, they refer to warp speed as being an express measurement of velocity. Whereas in the original series and Enterprise and even the Kelvin timeline movies, we see warp factor being described as an amount of energy that the warp engines are putting out. For example, in the Star Trek movie 2000, in the 2009 Star Trek movie, simply called Star Trek, we see that the Enterprise is sort of stuck on the almost in the event horizon of a black hole, and they've engaged the warp drive, so they're traveling at warp, but the resultant velocity is pretty much zero because the gravity well of that black hole is preventing them from achieving warp velocity. But their warp drive is still engaged, so they still have a warp factor for their current state, at least in terms of the 23rd century scale. We see it again in Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, where the HMS Bounty, which is the Klingon bird of prey that the crew of the Enterprise have captured, engages warp drive while still within the Earth's atmosphere, but it seems to take a couple of minutes for it to leave the atmosphere and enter Earth orbit. And then it only takes a few seconds for the Bounty to make it from Earth orbit to solar orbit, or at least close to the Sun. Now that doesn't add up in terms of the numbers of how fast it's actually traveling, except if you consider that the gravitational well, the gravity field of the Earth might be interfering with the warp drive, which means that it's not able to achieve faster than light velocity, even though it has a fully engaged warp drive, and its warp factor might actually be somewhere in the area of 4 or 5, warp 4 or warp 5. So expressed in 23rd century or earlier terms, they are traveling at warp, but expressed in 24th century terms, they're not. Although their warp drive might be engaged and it's expending a lot of energy, it's simply not traveling at warp. So that's one set of inconsistencies. It looks like that warp speed scale change is what leads to a lot of those apparent inconsistencies. But that doesn't solve our problem with Kronos, the Klingon homeworld. How is it possible that the NX-01 Enterprise could travel from Earth to Kronos in less than a week, using only a warp 5 engine? In fact, if I remember correctly, I don't think they even travel higher than warp factor 4.5 the entire journey. So how is that possible? Well, I hinted at it in the last example when we were talking about how gravitational fields can influence the efficiency of a warp drive. So if you engage a warp drive within a heavy gravitational field, it will diminish the effectiveness of that warp drive so much that you might not even be able to achieve faster than light velocity, even though your warp drive is engaged. And gravitational fields aren't the only environmental thing out there that could potentially have an impact on the efficiency of your warp drive. Things like atmospheres, gaseous nebulae, debris, and most importantly, now here's something we're going to get into the weeds about: subspace density. So what does subspace density mean? So subspace is the main conceit, the technological conceit that warp drive and most of the futuristic technology in the Star Trek universe is kind of based around. And subspace is never clearly defined, obviously, because it's technology we don't have yet. It's science that doesn't yet exist. But it refers to something like a dimension. It's not actually a dimension. The X, Y, and Z and time. Those are the 4 dimensions of space-time. Subspace seems to be something like a dimension, but not quite. That you can think of it as existing just below space-time, hence subspace. A craft engages warp drive, it warps space-time, but it does so somehow interacting with subspace. So it shifts the ship partially from normal space-time into the subspace realm, not entirely, but in part, so that it's able to travel faster than the speed of light, and then when the warp drive is disengaged, it shunts it back into normal space-time again. When you're using subspace radio, which is the thing I referred to earlier, what you're doing there is you're forcing an ordinary radio signal into the subspace realm, so that where the speed of light is much, much higher in subspace than it is in normal space-time, it's able to travel through subspace until eventually it emerges on the other end, closer to the receiver, hopefully, and it's able to travel much longer distances, many, many times the speed of light. When you've got space and you've got this layer of subspace that exists below ordinary space-time, why would that be an environmental factor in determining the efficiency of warp drives? Well, we've seen in several places, things like Star Trek Enterprise, the episode where we met Emery Erickson, the creator of the transporter, that some areas of space correspond with areas in subspace that have a high density, so much so that no stars can exist in that area. We also saw in the Voyager episode, the Omega Directive, that subspace can be destroyed in an area around a specific corresponding area in space-time. Specifically, there was a particle called the Omega particle that, if it grew unstable, it could destroy space-time for as much as a light year in every direction, which meant that warp travel wouldn't be possible in that region. That's established in canon, that the density or apparent density of subspace corresponding to a region of space-time affects the efficiency of your warp drive. So the less dense that subspace is, the less efficient your warp drive is. So no matter how much energy you're pumping through your warp coils, your resultant velocity will reduce corresponding with the density of subspace. Whereas high density subspace areas will allow you to travel more efficiently, so you use less energy to get more resultant speed out of your engines. So how does this solve the Kronos problem? Well, we've seen that the relative subspace density of regions in space changes over time. We saw in the Next Generation that traveling through space on its own with your warp engines can affect the density of subspace and thus disrupt potential future warp travel. It stands to reason, it's never been explicitly stated in canon, but it's not unreasonable that the density of subspace from region to region might fluctuate on its own. You might see pockets of subspace density forming spontaneously and then flowing to other regions or something. We don't really know how subspace behaves. Perhaps it interacts with the rest of the world gravitationally. It's something like dark matter or something like that. But what could potentially solve this problem is if subspace does behave in a gravitational way, it might be attracted to itself, which means that it might become clumpy, corresponding to normal space. Which means that you might see nodules or even strands of high-density regions of subspace. Now, if you imagine it this way, what if there was a region of high subspace density, roughly 75 to 90 light years long, stretching more or less from where Earth is in sector 001 to where Kronos is. And then you, on your little Warp 5 starship, you could jump into that high-density subspace region and zip along that region almost all the way to Kronos, obtaining much more performance out of your warp engines than they are designed to produce. So although your engines are performing at warp factor 4.5 by the TOS scale, which means that they're putting out enough energy to meet the 4.5 requirement, your resultant velocity is more like warp factor 9.99, which gets you all the way from Earth to Kronos in 4.5 days. We see that in the film Star Trek Into Darkness, in the Kelvin timeline, almost a century afterwards, the Enterprise there is able to travel almost that same distance, or most of that same distance, in a similar time period. We see also in the normal timeline in Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, the USS Excelsior is able to close a significant portion of that same gap in a reduced time period. But by the time we get to the Next Generation, there's no indication that traveling between Earth and Kronos is any faster than it is traveling through, at any other point in the galaxy. And this might be that because so many ships have traveled back and forth along that corridor, that high-density subspace corridor over the decades, that corridor has worn thin and the subspace density has reduced, approaching average subspace density for the galaxy. This might also go some way towards explaining the weird warp speed anomaly that we see in Star Trek V, the Final Frontier, in which the Enterprise A is able to make it from Nimbus 3, which is in Federation space, to the center of the galaxy, 30,000 light years away, in a relatively short period of time. In Star Trek V, they don't explain how long it is, but based on our observations of the characters, the clothes they wear, and that kind of thing, they don't seem to take all that long. Perhaps days, maybe weeks, probably not as long as months, to travel all that distance. 30,000 light years with a Warp 6 starship should take you something like 30 years to travel that distance. We're not talking days or weeks, but they seem to make it. Now, that could potentially be explained by a high-density subspace corridor. The fact that these corridors are never explicitly mentioned on screen could be down to the fact that it never occurs to them to mention it. Or it could be that Federation technology doesn't exist to be able to detect these subspace corridors at distance, which means that they're just flying along, and sometimes they'll go fast and sometimes they'll go slow. And if you're traveling in an area where a lot of ships are going, they can map out where roughly these corridors are, kind of like how mariners of old used to be able to map out shoals and near coastlines, and they were able to inform fellow mariners to avoid them because they might be dangerous. Some corridors are good, some corridors are bad, and also things like deep sea currents that might be beneficial or harmful towards navigation. So it's kind of not a very satisfying solution to the problem, because it doesn't there's no in-universe confirmation that this is how the thing works, and also there's no real correlation to real-world science or technology that we're able to establish firmly. But as far as I know, there are no direct contradictions to this hypothesis that we've seen in universe. The Star Trek V issue, although it's not fully explained by this hypothesis, what I call the variable subspace density hypothesis, although it's not fully explained, it does go a long way towards explaining it. There's another idea though that I'll explain in a future video if a question comes up about how another possible solution for how we might solve that one. But the variable density subspace hypothesis goes a long way towards shoring up a lot of those apparent inconsistencies in warp drive, warp technology, warp speed, and faster than light travel. All right, if you think I've missed anything, or if you still have questions that you don't think I've covered in this in this analysis, please drop them below. You can find me on the D20 Discord. You can find me on Facebook sometimes, Twitter even. Ask me follow-up questions, ask me new questions. I'll try to address them in a future video. But that's it for now. SWAT out.